Hello everyone and welcome to Of God in Mind. Today we're going to be discussing um, a bit of a vague topic really. So we're going to be sort of starting talking about um, how we think the universe came to be, how it's ordered, a sort of creation or not creation sort of thing, but not focusing too much on that. But what instead we'll be focusing on is sort of how that shapes how we view the world and how we view humans and our interaction with the environment and other things. So with me here tonight, we have Jacob
Hey,
and Reggie
Hello.
and Adam.
evening, folks.
So let's just start. Hang on, my volume is higher than I thought. But while I'm fixing that, let's just sort of talk about what we think about how the universe came to be. Um, so I'm not myself personally. I'm probably more along the lines of a sort of directed creationist, or I'm not sure what the term is. I've forgotten it. So I don't believe that the world was sort of directly um, formed over a literal 6 day period, 6,000 years ago. I think more that the Earth was sort of begun, and um, then sort of evolution and natural processes have shaped a lot of what we have now. Perhaps with some direction, perhaps with none. I'm not real strict on that point, with the only exception being that I think something special happened in the creation of humanity. So the sort of for me, it talks about like when it talks about creation and so forth in Genesis 2 about humanity. I don't think that's and this mankind being created in God's image. I take that to be a spiritual sort of consciousness that is being created because God is spirit and not a sort of physical form. I think that there were sort of hominids and human ancestors before, but then at some point, probably around 16 to 30,000 years ago, what at, there's a point in human history where we have a massive leap in sort of human intelligence and interaction. We have things such as fire and so forth. Well, it's often linked to harnessing fire, but I'd sort of put at some point there we have the sort of human divine influence on humanity happens there, which makes out of man more than a hominid, more than a sort of walking ape, to be what we are now, a conscious, moral, society creating being. I've got a big article on this too if you want my sort of full look at how I think all this lines up with Genesis 1 and 2, which I'll link below. But anyway, that's my views. Who's next?
Well, it wasn't me who made that noise. I'll go next. I guess to alternate back and forth a bit, I suppose. uh, Simply put, I guess I take a rather materialist approach to things. I don't feel that, I haven't seen any evidence for anything that I would consider spiritual or supernatural. So, as far as I have been able to tell, the universe was formed in a Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago, plus or minus whatever the most recent error bars are. Uh, then went through a long period of forming stars and galaxies until eventually 4-ish billion years ago, Earth formed, and then at some point, life on Earth got started, and evolution took us to where we currently are. Evolution being a undirected process that essentially only favors what survives. The end goal of evolution isn't humanity or cats or cool parrots. It's just whatever happened to survive whatever nature threw at it. And so as far as humanity is concerned, I suppose, I mean, I feel that we're a moral species, and our morality comes from having to live with each other and grow up with each other and rely on each other as a form of community. I guess that's without going too far on to rambling. Essentially that's my view.
Alright, I'll go next. So, my view currently, to the best of my understanding, is that I think the Earth is quite possibly, well, the universe is quite possibly around about-ish 14 billion years ago, 30.8, let's go with that. That's the most recent error bar. Seems fair. Now, honestly, I think most of what we know, and that, or can at least infer from scientific literature, I think is pretty fair to go with. The only real difference is I think that the authorship of all of that is by God. Mechanism and the, I guess, what it looks like. Look at in science. I think science is really great for looking at how the physical world kind of came to be, but I believe that the authorship is God. Now, so of course that means I don't believe in exactly 7 24-hour time periods in the days of creation. Merely, I think, saying is that, so what Genesis is kind of showing is more poetic. Hey, God is the author of everything in creation. Now, what that in terms of morality and relationship in some way gets to people, well, are set apart for a relationship with God. And there's a special relationship that God has with humanity. Really cool. Because God wants relationship. And so that's why people, for better or worse, have choice. And that's really, I think, really important in terms of morality is that we as people inherently make decisions that are, can be beneficial for us or others, but often for us, if it's even in an indirect way. Essentially, I think when it comes to morality and so on, it's something that these people can't act perfectly in and of ourselves alone. I want to use that terminology. So that's why I believe relationship with God is essential. In a sense, perfectly moral. It doesn't say people don't do good things. It's saying about moral perfection in terms of the eyes of God. It's not something we as people can attain just by trying hard. So that's kind of my very short summary of my viewpoints at the moment on creation up to morality of people.
Yeah, this is a really loaded question. I guess I take a fairly agnostic kind of approach to existence of God and the creation of the universe. So I just don't think about how the universe came to be based on the science. There was something called a Big Bang, which is a term used to mock this idea, but we observed the expansion of the universe. So going backwards in time, we know that kind of originated from something smaller. And I think before that, I can't comment on it, and I don't really see the point of trying to comment on it. So I guess that's why I am agnostic about, sure, maybe it was initiated by God or something, but I don't care. Does that make sense? Yeah. My interpretation of the rest of the universe is basically through the eyes of what we observe with science, basically. And I guess you guys were all talking about morality. Um, and whether that's inherent to us, I think that is pretty, like, yeah, humans we're pack animals in a way. That's how we evolved. So we try to do things which benefit everyone, doesn't hurt particular people. And I think that is kind of ingrained in some of our morals and ethics that we have brought in to our society. Um, yeah, I mean, and also about life on Earth. Life basically evolved as soon as the conditions were correct, um, for extremophiles at least. So I don't want to comment on the timing of that, because we only have one data point, and I'd be a bad statistician if I just look at that one case. Um, yeah, so I guess my stance is agnostic, as in I don't really care if there is or isn't a god.
All right. And for the sake of completeness, I'll sort of elaborate a bit on the literal creationist point of view, because this is a view um, I have held for a while. That when I first sort of became a Christian, from originally being a materialist evolutionist, um, briefly became literal creationist, and then saw some nuances in Genesis that I thought were very well, they allowed evolution and God's action in creation to coexist really well. But the sort of literal um, creationist view, it's not always 6 literal days so much, but that's pretty common. And the common date is around 6,000 years ago, based on work from, I think it's of the Middle Ages by a monk, tracing back all the dates we have in the Bible, using that to form a date which was around 6,000 years ago. And the basic point of view there.
Channel timed out.
Whoop, we lost
User
someone.
entered your channel.
So yeah, the basic point of view there is, at least in Christian circles, obviously, we aren't the only ones to have a creation myth.
User entered your channel.
But the idea is that at that point, 6,000 years ago, creation at the hand of God happened literally as
User in your channel timed out.
Someone's having real big connection issues there. I don't know if you'll hear that on the recording, but anyway, the idea being that completely lost my point. Yeah, so happened literally as recorded in Genesis. First, I forget the order, but you have sort of the sky and space separated, then you have land and sky separated, then you have the stars, the moon, everything created, then the seas, then the animals, and then humanity on the last day. And there's not a whole lot of nuance to it, really. It's not as unsupported as you would seem. You can find various evidence points that people have looked at to see a creationist sort of evidence. It's not completely without thinking, but myself personally, I do prefer the God kicked off evolution point of view. So now to get into our more nebulous part of how this shapes our sort of, I guess our views of society is a way to put it. Well, because like, I'll just start with sort of what I was thinking, and that can be somewhat of an example. So like, I think one big difference, at least for me, the thing that stands out most, and the thing that sort of gets me to this idea of to being human and humanity being created as a is a sort of mental spiritual change and not a we were physically made change, is that the things that we, at least in the Bible, would consider to be moral actions and moral choices are often incredibly at odds with your natural, um, with the sort of natural animalistic style choices, even in a group herd mentality. And for some background, I probably should have mentioned at the start, I'm currently a biology student, third year-ish. Um, a lot of stuff is just personal research though. Personally, the university course has not been much worth up until this point, but it is what it is. But yeah, I have a background in biology, and as I said before, evolution and animal behavior is kind of my jam. So anyway, in a lot of ways, nature is survive at all costs, regardless of those around you. Sometimes with regard to kinship or sharing, for purposes of survival. Like you can find examples of altruistic type behavior in animal groups, but they're very different to human behavior. And a lot of the things that sort of the Bible considers sin are things that are quite normal and natural from a naturalistic worldview. Monogamy is like for example, adultery, monogamy, and so forth is an idea. Animal sexual ethics don't really exist. You have some species that are monogamous. A lot of those will also just cheat whenever they get the chance. You have most species, monogamy is quite rare. You have some species that just outright they just are polygamous. They'll have many males or females in the group. Some will just take what they can get. Like in a lot of species, it's just males compete among themselves with the females for the best mates. The females then go off and do whatever with go raise the kids completely unassisted. And there's even a bunch of species where like your breeding is done entirely through rape. So those common ducks you see in a pond, yeah, that's how they breed. They're like really nasty. But then you've got ethics on, like, nature is very brutal. The strong survive, the weak you just kick around. And there's very little focus on, even once you own offspring, you don't focus on the weak. Like birds, a lot of birds will lay 2 or 3 eggs, but only the strong one will survive. They'll just put food there, the two continue against it, and the strong keeps getting stronger, and the parents make no effort, and eventually the chick dies, and that's it. You've got your one chick there that's strong. Obviously, regard for the weak, for the downtrodden and the oppressed is a very big thing in the Bible and in Christian morality. Okay, I just got distracted here because something ate my baby. I didn't even know that was possible. Oh no, it illustrates my point quite well though. If you're watching the video, I just had a mother lynx and one of my babies just got eaten by a fox. But anyway, the basic point, I've probably rambled on a lot here with biological nature, is that the things that come from evolution, from a biological nature, are very inconsistent with the things that we often practice in terms of morality and basically all our moral systems. So to me, the big difference in what is humanity, how is it formed, what the difference is, what is sin, is a lot of it comes down to overcoming the natural, the primal, the animal nature in favor of that which is divine, that which is spiritual. It's coming to know that we have a creator. Um, that we have a creator who helps and directs us, helps and directs the universe, and to overcome that and to form something that's beyond our sort of primeval nature. Obviously, there's a lot more to Christian doctrine than that, but that's sort of what I see is a lot of the creational basis of that sort of thing. And so how this will sort of play out a lot um, in views in modern society, like I see a lot of there's a lot of sort of idea of um, do what is natural, do what nature says, be one with nature, listen to your emotions, emotions being sort of very primal instincts, that sort of thing. And to me, this is just absolutely against what society is. It's a sort of dominance over nature. It's man controlling over nature, controlling and following the sort of this separate part, this consciousness that's given that overrides nature. I actually got a lot of this thinking from Plato. One of his dialogues is a lot about how clearly there is more to the world than just nature, because we have more to the mind than just the physical, because there is parts of the brain are at odds with each other. You can override, say you are hungry, you don't immediately go and eat. You can override that. You can fast. We can override our desires and our thoughts, so there must be something there beyond the natural, beyond instinct. And so I see a lot of this as complete folly, this match to just do what is right according to our own emotions and our own thoughts, because that's just inconducive with civilized morality in any real form. Even, and I don't use that in terms of like Western skyscraper sort of morality, even that, like, for example, native Indians aren't exactly so happy, tree huggy, one earth things as you popular culture would have us believe. A lot of that is also around humanity in control of nature. You can even see evidences of it in their language. Navajo especially, I think, has pretty good examples of this. But yeah, I think that's about all I wanted to say.
So, do you think that intelligence couldn't have arisen naturally if it weren't for the hand of God playing its part?
I think there's a difference between intelligence and consciousness. So as I sort of got to with the whole Plato idea, I think there's something different and unique about our minds, which is consciousness, that allows us to overcome the sort of natural animalistic type intelligence, because you've got some really intelligent animals out there. You've got animals that are just as good at problem solving as us, animals that can hunt better, that have crazy sensory organs and so forth that they can control. Animals that have highly sophisticated groups, but there's a lot of differences. There's languages that humans create. Humans have a abstract sort of conception of ideas. There's sort of spiritual ideas that seem to be sort of innate with humans from the earliest times. We have cave paintings and religious practices. This is all stuff that I see in no other animals, even things such as chimpanzees. That's a sort of step, not really even just a step above, but there's something different and distinct there. And I sort of think that's what makes us, that's what changed to make us human, if that makes sense.
What are your thoughts on some of our ancient, at this point, uh, relatives such as Neanderthal, where there, I guess, is, albeit controversial, but um, some evidence, I suppose, or some people, some scientists or anthropologists claim that they were capable of, say, producing art or, at the very least, tools.
Yeah, they're kind of interesting because like a lot of this research is new that they've done on Neanderthals. Previously, the whole sort of distinction was on um, like there was a strong distinction between humans and Neanderthals because we didn't see any evidence of abstraction from Neanderthals. There was no idea of there was no Neanderthal art. There was no Neanderthal burials. This stuff just wasn't seen. But now we've seen it. There's been findings that sort of contradict that, and there's been sort of findings that like there was a lot more interbreeding and so forth between Neanderthals than humans before. Like they're actually a subspecies of Homo sapiens now, normally, rather than a distinct species, which was previously the classification. Um, that might be a bit abstract to people, but basically it means that it can be still be a pretty big difference. For example, dogs and wolves are still the same species, but they're pretty different. But there's enough similarity there that biologically and physiologically they can communicate with each other, breed, and interact. So basically, on the topic of Neanderthals, I'm not real sure because there is still now those findings that are quite likely to be examples of not Aboriginal, um, Neanderthal art and burial practice. But whether that was there for Neanderthals or not, that stuff definitely was not around for Homo species before them.
So is the thought that, I mean, this probably isn't what you wanted the main topic of this episode to be on, but this will be my last question on the matter. But uh, how do you, at what point do you feel, so did Homo sapien, well, I guess Neanderthals died out. Um, is there a clear delineation where you feel that humanity became spiritually awakened slash intelligence that began to separate our species from its closest relatives? Uh,
Yeah. So
and
there's a point. I can't remember the timing of it. It's been a while since I looked too in depth into this, but there is a rather definite point because, like, you look at Homo sapiens, we've been around what 60 to 100,000 years or something, I think.
I think it's
Yet
about
human
200,000.
society and even complex like hunter-gatherer societies sprung up. Well, complex society is about 6,000 years old, 6 to 8,000, and it's about 30 or 40,000 where you have the more um, where you start having more complex family groups, hunter-gatherer societies start emerging. Um, there's a rather definite difference that you start having art appear, you start having all this other stuff appear, where as we don't really have older evidence of that. Like I think the oldest human evidence of that we have now is from here, from in Australia in the Kimberleys. They very recently found evidence of cave paintings and complex. It's not tool use. Tool use is something that animals have, and older homos definitely have as well. But some of the oldest evidence we have of cave painting and so forth is about 60,000 years old from here in Australia. And so it seems like something changed there. Like a lot of
Do you think it could have
research
been?
puts that as being fire, as being the difference. So that was when humanity learned to tame fire, and that gave us a whole bunch of other advances.
What
But
about
that's
the
when I put,
agricultural revolution?
that's much later. You have societies much later than that. because that sprung up in the Fertile Crescent area around 6 to 8 thousand years ago. That's when you start getting settled societies. You get big settlements like Catalhoyuk in Turkey, and then a bit after that you start getting Sumeria and Egypt appear. Though agriculture actually, there's evidence of it from about 10,000 years ago in Mesoamerica, a sort of primitive slash and burn type agriculture. But yeah, basically something happened at some point in relatively late human history that changed a lot of things for us as a species. And that's the point when I would put as the creation of humanity, so to speak. Like, I don't think it's innate to our physical brains, the difference that was made.
I've got a question. What is like the oldest religion? What is the first instances of religion?
Well, the
That's an
oldest
interesting one.
organized that we have evidence of is Hinduism. At least it's still around. Springing up in the Indus Valley about uh, 4,000 or so years ago, I suppose. You have, but at the same time, you have a lot of religions around there that aren't still around, such as the Mesopotamian polytheistic religions and so forth. Judaism springs up. That sort of historically, it happens around 1000 BC, or 1000 to 1500. Those very early dates are pretty contentious. And that's the point where you have where the Bible says Abraham came out of Mesopotamia, out of Ur, and started following the God that would become our Christian God.
So I have another question.
But you
So
have
religion,
sort of ritual beliefs before that we have no idea from. Like cave paintings seem to depict ritual and spiritual beliefs. You got burial practices that indicate some sort of transformation or belief in a life after death. So this is nothing we can really tell is a religion per se, and we have no idea what it's about, even if we could. But that's probably about as early as you get.
yeah. So what I was about to say is that religion is often it's often said that religion was developed to govern communities, and I guess that's the point of Hinduism is that it keeps the caste system because it encourages the lower caste to do their role because then they could get reincarnated in a higher caste. And I guess Egyptian civilization was also kind of built on the religion because their pharaohs were selected by the gods, and this is a system of government. Um, do you think like how do you feel about that? Like, well, yeah, how people interpret religion being a system of governance as opposed to being, I guess, actually spiritual.
I think there's a lot of, like, I know that theory. I think there's a lot of flaws with it in that it sort of comes from this assumption that you sort of have a whole bunch of egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies, basically just families working together before this point, and then you have a sort of caste system spring up, a religious system spring up to enforce that caste system. Um, and I think, well, sort of my first debate with it is that a lot of religions aren't really concerned with that. Like they sort of come up with this idea of, oh, there's a priestly class to help keep the people in check, but um, a lot of religions, the priestly class springs up a lot later. Sure, you have early god kings where the sort of king was viewed religiously, and perhaps you have ancestor worship, which is probably the oldest sort of idea that that people sort of the ancestors who've come before can still influence and can still change things for the world that is still happening. They can still provide guidance and direction. none of this is terribly concerned. Like Hinduism, obviously, you have some of that with the caste system. I don't know enough about Hinduism to know any sort of timeline on that, or even where that, how much that's encoded in old scriptures and so forth. But a lot of time, these like complex religions themselves, such as Hinduism, spring out of highly organized societies to begin with. So the Indus Valley civilization was also very advanced, highly organized.
And
But
very peaceful, apparently.
yeah, I have my doubts. Like we have,
They didn't find any weapons.
Well,
yeah, but we also don't find much at all. Like I think there's some
Mm.
degree to which that is true because you don't have things such as a warrior class. People don't encounter each other as much. A lot of that happens once you start getting really big, settled civilizations that have enough spare resources to start specializing people into things such as a priestly class, a rulership class, and a warrior class. Before that, it's kind of everyone has to go out and hunt and work together, or everyone starves. Um, but like animals fight over territory to kick out other animals to make sure there's enough food. We have that in tribal societies and so forth that have followed that same sort of system. It's not as if the sort of Native Americans or Indigenous Australians and so forth didn't have war before Western civilization with its agriculture came. You still had territorial disputes and skirmishes. But anyway, I'm completely sidetracked now. Point being, I think the difference, I don't think religion was created to um, shape society. I think it's a sort of natural outpouring of a drive to spirituality by people. Like, I'm not sort of saying this is in, like, my Christian view is that it's, we were created by a God, it started with knowledge of that God, and then that is the natural continuation of that. But this sort of drive to spirituality where people want to explain and understand the world around them, like your early polytheistic pantheons and rituals, they're not like the pantheons are concerned with explaining things. You have a god for each little natural process. You have gods for often different areas. You have gods governing sky and stars. They're often gods, and then you have the your early rituals, like your religious rituals, are often shaped with enacting some sort of outcome to do a favorable outcome. So, say you want to uh, you want to like have a successful hunt. Have you might symbolically stage a hunt, have slaughter an animal to appease the gods of the forest, or offer grain to give rain, and a lot of it's highly symbolic in nature. Like we learnt that, oh hey, babies come from um, men and women, they come from semen, they come from blood. Um, so a lot of cultures, when agriculture first started coming around, they'd think, well, to improve our harvest, to have more fertility in our soil, we'll just infuse it with with semen or with blood or various other things, and that's essentially what the rain does. So it's sort of religion is often very unconcerned with actually regulating societal practices and more with a sort of innate influencing nature, influencing the world around us and understanding the world around us. So does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I just don't know how to continue on from that.
Well, I've basically given a lecture at the moment, so what do other people have to say on this matter?
and on the
I mean,
origins of society as we know it, as far as modern humans, or
Or just back to our sort of starter point of how views of creation and so forth influence society.
well, I think the biggest one for me is because I view God as the creator of everything, it's very logical for me to then say he's, God is God. He deserves to be served. Like there's no question if you can make a universe and I can, make a house on Minecraft. There's one's a bit more impressive than the other. Yeah, you know what I'm saying? Like God is God. That's my view. So for me, the reference means that instead of trying to, I guess, the God will say, oh, I'm more awesome than you, and so I can do what I want with my own life. It's like, well, I need to consider that in light of that. But it's not a fearful thing. It's also like can be a very encouraging thing because, like, well, look, all these things out there that you know I could be fearful of, that actually have a hope in God. So I don't have to fear these things in the sense of hopelessness. Obviously, I don't want to, there's many different ways of define the word fear, but like, I'm talking about overall here, overall picture. Does that make sense? Yeah, nah?
Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, as for me, I don't think I have too much to add to my earlier opening statement on the matter, I suppose. I mean, I guess, actually identify myself with a label as Reggie did earlier, I suppose I'd consider myself an agnostic atheist in the sense that I see no evidence for the existence of God, but I fully acknowledge that if something is outside of the universe, I can't possibly know of it being inside the universe. And I mean, it doesn't really impact on my day-to-day life in any measurable fashion. I mean, I guess that's the biggest thing. I mean, my lack of religion or spirituality just really doesn't impact on my day-to-day life, and I just go about my life as knowing that it's the only life I'll ever have. And I suppose I can obviously be unhappy if that seems finite, but it's no better or worse than any other member of our species ever got, so I have to make do with it.
If we have nothing else to discuss, I think it's a kind of dangerous question to ask about religion and society. Is it okay to ask it?
Oh, sure. Why not?
Okay, so you were saying that humans had to overcome some of their primal instincts to become human, and that was could have been guided by God in a way. Yeah.
Yeah.
So then that leads me on to some other discussions that society is having a lot like now about, marriage equality or safe schools for people with gender dysphoria. And the argument against that is it's not natural. Well, there's many arguments, but that's like one of the most common ones about that, not being the way nature was intended to. But you're just saying that in order to understand our religion, we had to overcome some of these primal instincts. So how do those kind of get married together, or is that just a different argument completely?
I mean, that's going to vary a bit depending on people. Like certainly in my course, there's some sort of elements to where I guess a lot of it depends on, like, I don't want to get too far into the whole gay marriage debate, but a lot of that is centered on what is marriage. Is it something different from a reproductive sort of biological relationship? And that'll shape sort of how you view it, because obviously natural biological reproductive relationship is male and female, but then you have differences in that it is, like, I won't say it's not meant to be monogamous, because human mating strategy is definitely meant to be monogamous, because we have a child that is dependent on us for at very least about 10 to 12 years, likely much longer. We are very much a species dependent on a monogamous type mating style where both parents are around. Um, but things such as adultery, things such as sort of um, communal group, like polygamy type setups. Um, all this stuff is sort of equally, but like sexually natural. And homosexuality as a, like, monogamous homosexuality is a very, on the one hand, it's unnatural in that that committed relationship makes zero sense from a biological point of view. Um, but there's also some degree to which homosexual activity, at least as sexual activity, is rather natural. Like, I think humans have a sort of innate tendency to bisexuality for various reasons, because you see this a lot in ancient cultures and a lot even in Victorian era cultures. I was reading a book on sexuality from the Victorian era the other day, and it was these guys talking about their experiences, and like 5 out of 6 of them had sort of same-sex encounters at a young age, um, and then just kind of um, change their views over time. But um, yeah, so in a lot of ways, the Christian position is sort of against nature in this debate. It's a sort of principle above, different from nature, but it's also like they're both sort of against nature, and at the same time, both argue as being for nature as well. Well, we see homosexuality in animals, or um, in God's original plan for creation. There, we don't see homosexuality. So basically, you have neither is really natural or not natural, and both sides will argue it's either natural or not natural for the other side. Because, like, I've seen plenty of arguments for the reason that we shouldn't have monogamous marriage at all, because human sexuality is not natural, or is at least not solely monogamous, stuff like that. Because when it comes down to it, marriage is a social construct governing a biological sort of principle. So you have that element of both. Does that sort of answer what you were asking?
Yeah, I mean, I guess you basically painted that's not black and white. There's more nuances to this debate.
Yeah. And I think to sort of marry that in our original topic, a lot of how you think of that will be shaped by what you think of um, like of creation. So is society, is human nature what we make it, or is it some sort of thing, external thing that was made for us, and sort of like sort of our view of morality. Like, for a Christian perspective, no, we do not make our morality. It was made for us by God. We were given this particular way of doing things, which is not as black and white as a lot of people will have you believe. We aren't. I don't want to use the Quran as too much of an example, because I don't know it. I don't know all its nuances, but it's very laid out in how to live your life, with rather strict ways on how to practice and do things from bathing to what food to eat to that sort of thing. Whereas even in the Old Testament, the Bible has a lot of those rules, but is a lot more concerned with principles to live by, sort of guiding ideas to live your life by rather than specifics. Now I've forgotten where I was going with that. But yeah, basically this being that when you're, if you think that we create morality, then redefining marriage is a very easy step to take. It's okay, there seems to be no problems with this. It doesn't seem to really hurt anyone. So naturally we can reshape this to take into account this new practice that's emerged. Whereas if you think that there's something natural, a natural imperative to biological man-woman monogamy, and or if you think there's something spiritual to it, something driven by a religion or a previous social idea, because it's, you have a lot of social conservatives who are equally for marriage just being man and woman. So it's, when you've got that sort of a view of things, that's when you're likely to go for or oppose same-sex marriage.
The whole dichotomy of whether morality was created for us or whether we created it is a rather simple way to put it that I haven't heard before.
I mean, I feel like this also plays into how much you can control your own path or destiny in ways, because surely you must feel like you have some, I guess, if you believe that morality was created for you, then how much control do you have over yourself? That's why I guess we creating morality makes more sense, but some people might not want to have that, I guess, responsibility. That might not be the right way of wording it, but you kind of get where I'm coming from?
Yeah,
Oh
so
yeah, I get where
like,
you're coming from. I just think the like I was saying earlier, you know, if I believe God's created the universe, then why can't He create the moral rule book? I want to call it that. It's His universe. We apply whatever rules He wants us to. That's how I see that.
yeah, and I think like this is a debate. I'm not sure how much you would have been exposed to this, but it's not as if it's black and like the question of gay marriage. There's more nuance to it among Christians than is it right or wrong. In that, there's the question of, even if you think it's wrong biblically, is society having such a rule wrong? How much should society be governed by, like, how much should those who don't follow the Christian way of thinking be governed to like sort of Christian morality, even if we think it's right? Should people be able to determine these things for themselves? So
User in your channel timed out. User entered your channel.
yeah, like personally, I mean, like, we're in a democracy. My view is we're in a democracy. We have a vote. I'm glad that we are, as flawed as this plebiscite is, and I don't want to dwell on that too long. If we're going to try and determine this sort of thing, then let's determine it by a vote, and whatever wins is what wins, and we deal with that. So,
But I
despite
guess that's different though, because you can have this utilitarian point of view in that what pleases the masses should be correct, but that can sometimes mean you're kind of putting down a minority. So sometimes democracy doesn't really work in that way if the majority is kind of, bringing harm to a minority. So I guess the question is what is right and what is right is determined by people's understanding of their morals and ethics.
Yeah. And this is like, I mean, there's no answer to this sort of thing. Um, sure, like there's that famous quote, democracy is, I forget what it is. It's something along the lines of democracy is a terrible system, except for all the other ones we've tried. Democracy is the worst system ever, except for all the others that we've tried. Personally, I'm not a massive fan of democracy anyway, but it's the system we got. For similar reasons to what you think, I don't think the majority always makes the best rules. But anyway, to sort of keep this a bit more focused, we have this, like, I think Jacob sort of gave us a bit of a crash course earlier too, but the sort of whole sort of story of the Bible is that people people do a really bad job of making rules and ruling a society. Like the whole Old Testament is basically the story of the nation of Israel, which was sort of started to be God's kingdom and God's representative on the planet. And given all this extensive rule system that you've probably seen quotes of, such as Leviticus and so forth, but then the latter half of that is all how they've completely and utterly failed to do that, how they've taken the sort of letter of these laws and forgotten the principles behind them. Um, they've seen that view of marriage and somewhat kept it, but they've forgotten to actually love and care for their wives, and they mistreat the orphan, the widow, the powerless among them, all this stuff. They hold to sort of this letter of the law, but have completely missed the point. So you got a lot of the Bible concerned about that, and that's essentially what the New Testament is about. Jesus often conflicts with a religious group called the Pharisees, that they are sort of this representative of old Israel and its laws to the letter, rather than sort of around the concept of it. And there's a whole lot of complexity in how much that all plays out, how much we should follow, like what is letter of the law, what is concept of the law, that sort of thing, is rather complex in debate. But basically, what I'm getting at here is working all this stuff out is also a rather big concern of the Bible, and the general conclusion it comes up to is we suck at it. What we need to just do is keep in mind and remember our Creator, remember God, follow the example given to us by Jesus, which is God come among us in the flesh to help teach us on some of these things, and eventually to make it so that even though we've screwed up, even though we failed so much, we don't need that perfection to find an eternity with Christ, with God. Like the Bible is basically a story of humanity screwing up at ruling itself, and this is how we should turn and look and think of things and follow God in spite of all that, and to sort of help with all that. And I can't speak too extensively to other religions, but I know that this is a concern with other groups as well. Like just before this started, I was reading an article on sort of the Chinese conception of, I suppose this is more Confucianism is kind of religion, but not. But they have this sort of idea of heaven and the mandate of heaven, the sort of right ordering of things on earth to reflect the things in heaven, and making it so that, and so this sort of idea that to have things rightly ordered on earth is to follow this divine principle, this otherworldly sort of standard and code laid out for us. And when that's not happening, you start having disasters, the people turn against you. The ruler is no longer fit to rule because he's lost the mandate of heaven for ruling.
I guess
So could,
tying. Sorry, Reggie,
Uh,
go on.
no, go. You go.
I was going to subtly change the topic, but did you have something connected to this?
Oh no, I was gonna say, like the mandate in heaven could, in this case of Confucianism, could be taken as, the moral compass that is defined by God in that case. That's all. I was just a comment.
Yeah,
Uh, Sorry, go, Jesse.
I was just saying, yeah, like it's a bit more obscure how much, especially Confucius himself seems to have had, like the article was literally debating how much of his mandate of heaven was spiritual or not. The older, like most of my knowledge of China is sort of the really old Shang dynasty and so forth, where it was definitely considered a legit principle. And ancient Egypt worked the same. You have this sort of heavenly guidance, this idealized world of how things are run, how the gods run things, and so forth. And the job of Earth is to emulate that, to just live that out and live in accordance with that. So there's a degree
Yeah,
What I
how's
was
that
going,
diff?
especially in your
Okay.
early sort of religions, there is no real division between spiritual, social, psychological, practical, material. All that sort of thing is very interconnected. Um, and even like these days we think about it differently, but we can sort of, I've seen examples of it before on like quantum physics. Like we think of that as physical processes, but when you describe them out, how much like religion or magic do they sound? Here we have this particle that is, sometimes it's in this form of a particle, sometimes it's in this form of a wave, um, and it can be in one place and be in another at the same time and change states and so forth. So we can still think of some things in this way. A sort of materialistic and scientific method have changed a lot of things, but if you're trying to sort of understand the ancient mind and thinking on this sort of thing, it's breaking down these barriers and categories is pretty essential to start off with, because simply everything was a lot more connected in thought, because a lot less was known and a lot less was categorized like this. Anyway, Adam, you were changing the
Adam?
topic.
I was connecting two of our different topics, I suppose, because we were talking about uh, getting morality from religion, especially because, as you say, humans are bad at it. And then you were talking about how, at some point in the distant past, our species became an event occurred that separated our species from every other species, in that we had some form of spiritual or intelligence awakening. Um, how? What are your thoughts on different religions? Because I mean, you draw your morality from the Christian God and the Bible, but different religions exist concurrently with Christianity that might have their similarities, but they also have their differences and different practices and different moralities. And if human morality, I mean, presumably there can't be multiple creators. So if there's but a single creator who gave that spark to humanity, how is it diverged, essentially?
Well, like as you said, I sort of see it as there was this single creator, but I see that as sort of being. So this is a bit of an area of interest and study for me actually. In like I believe that the Christian God is the creator and the original God, and um, like the only one at least worthy of being called a God. Whether there's other spiritual beings or not, I'm agnostic on, I suppose you would say. But from that sort of original creator, we've had divergence. There's sort of been a um, like we started from Eden, so to speak, knowing that God is creator, but over time humanity and cultures drift, religions drift. Like you can see a lot of similarities in religions, especially very early religions, and that's sort of my area of interest, is finding all of what some of these similarities are and how they sort of how you can sort of see the influences of the Christian God in these other religions, but then you also have um, you have these I suppose it's based like the short answer there is just ideological drift. People like this all happened a long time ago that with the Christian God. He also gave us an element of free will and self-governance. That's part of what comes with being the image of God, is being creative, is being um, able to decide and determine these things. That's sort of the knowledge of good and evil. Is we took for ourselves the ability to determine some of this, and we've done that. We've sort of shaped different religions and different cultures from this original template and come up with a bunch of these differing ideas and differing systems. And there is a lot of universals in human culture, it's worth noting. So for example, this is or at least in the past 20 years, is the first time we've ever had monogamous homosexual relations as a sort of marriage unit come about. It's not the first time for homosexuality, but even the cultures that had homosexuality before, it just wasn't even considered. Like, it was considered, okay, you'll be homosexual and you'll be married as well, and you'll just have children. That's how things are.
Could
And
that, sorry, I'm just thinking of something else. Could that be because of our own biases when we study ancient, I guess, societies and find the artifacts? Because there's recently the thing about, the Viking burial was, people thought that was a woman until recent evidence suggested, sorry, a man until recent evidence suggests it was a woman, and that could have been because of our biases at the time.
it can be a
But that's
bit,
like,
but we have,
yeah.
like, it depends on your culture a lot, I suppose. And there's the occasional outlier, for example, patriarchy and polygamy are somewhat the norms. Not so much polygamy, but you don't really have women with many husbands, is what I was getting at there. But there are some exceptions to that. Well, there's one exception. I'm not sure if there's even multiple exceptions. Like, there's a tribe in, I think it's the Amazon, could be wrong, where you do have women dominating society with many husbands around them. And
I mean,
so
there are a
there's
few
a degree to which,
maternalistic societies.
yeah, like maternalistic is a bit different to
Yeah.
that sort of thing, and matrilineal and that sort of thing. And there's sort of
Sorry,
certain biological reasons.
matriarchy. Sorry.
Yeah, that's the word. There's certain biological reasons why this might be as well, such as the fact that childbirth was incredibly lethal and women were very likely to die earlier in the elder periods. So that's a downside for things such as family sort of continuance and so forth. But anyway, to the sort of original point, we have, especially once you hit sort of Roman era types, so sort of like around turn of AD type stuff, most societies have writing, or at least extensive oral records and governance systems that we can sort of look at. So while we might not know a lot of common life practices stuff, we do at very least know law codes and societal practices and a lot of that. This isn't for all cultures, obviously, and we might someday find examples. But once you start getting records, you start getting a much better idea of how at least some things work. We might know exactly how peasant life worked in medieval England, but we know what laws they were under, for example.
I guess pursuant to my question. I mean, you were talking about ideological drift, but I guess in many religions there's at least some form of a two-way communication, lack of a better word, between the god or gods and humans, even if, say, that relationship is maybe more one-sided in some cases than others. Um, but if the creator deity is speaking to the created, um, how is such a deity permissive of the drift then? I know this is a very different topic, but
As in, is the creator deity permissive of the drift, or the
yeah, I
other
mean it's
deity?
a different. Oh, so I mean, if there's but a single creator deity, and over time the human interpretation of creation and religion has diverged from what it initially was, and you end up with many different religions. If humans continue to be in contact with such a deity, is the deity uh, permissive of the fact that some people have a different set of uh, morals and ethics to people at a different um, place on the globe or a different place in time?
I see. Yeah, so like I can only really argue or say this from Christian perspective, and only pretty briefly in depth, because like it's a like the short answer is a lot of the Bible is about this idea that no, it's not really okay that mankind has turned its back on its creator, and formed his likeness. Like you might have heard the Ten Commandments, you have the sort of idea of idolatry is on there. That's this idea of mankind turning its back on its creator and instead fashioning gods, um, and various things in the likeness of things that were created instead. So rather than giving respect to the one who made it all, they're giving respect to things that were made. Um, and like there's a degree to which the sort of moral cultural drift is rather accepted. Like for example, I mentioned the Old Testament Leviticus law codes and everything. They only ever applied to Israel, to sort of like their place is rather complicated to talk about, but at least they were some nation that was in some way special to, um, or set up to be special to God, and didn't end up doing that very well. But that was never to apply to the nations around them, and most of the laws weren't even to apply to foreigners living within the lands of Israel either. And the New Testament comes along and it's very much focused on principles and very much focused on, like, once Jesus comes and start teaching, I should probably use a bit less jargon here, but he's very much focused on simple universal principles that, um, and the New Testament letters expand on this a lot too. Like, we sort of miss a lot of it because these cultures are so distant from us, but there's sort of subtle, specific cultural details in each letter addressing certain parts of that culture and looking at how, um, sort of laying it out in a way that works for that culture. So it's not as if, like, Christianity shouldn't be this one big giant monoculture. That's not how it was really set out to be, is my view at least. And like, I'm actually working on a book on this at the moment, on the sort of cultural differences and the adaptations Christianity has undergone over time, not in the core scripture, but in the practice of it. Like how to shape and show these core ideas in different cultures. And it seems to be that something at least from what we read in the Old Testament, that the different cultures and the laying out of different nations and so forth is something God does and is actively involved in, and even communicating with other nations at other times for different things. Not so much in a creating a new religion sense. Often it's for a more specific purpose, but um, like the Creator wants everyone to come to Him and worship and know Him as creation. That's why Christians have this mandate to spread Jesus and Christianity to the world, and getting rid of all the and like it's incompatible to believe in Christianity and other gods. Is that much at least is pretty concrete. But in terms of culture, there's a degree of cultural relativity, I suppose would be the way to put it. We aren't given this specific universal code to a sort of Sharia law type thing that all believers in all nations should follow this. There's a degree open to interpretation and relativism, I suppose would be the best way to put it there. Each culture keeping this idea and working out the best way to do it on their own. Just remembering that there was one creator, and he is the creator, and he is the one who deserves the respect. Does that sort of answer that?
Yeah, I think it gets to aspects of what I asked. So I guess going from what you said, if someone who doesn't identify as Christian but is religious in some other respect is engaging with a dialogue with, I guess, the creator deity that, in as far as your beliefs are concerned, is the Christian deity, then that is just, even if the practices are different, that's just your God, I guess, adapting to different cultures.
Oh, so you mean like
Is that?
the moral code? Um,
Oh, I
so
mean, other religions make claims to speak to the creator deities. And if there's only one creator deity, is that the Christian God speaking in a way that's uh, better understood or adapted more to a different culture, but still the Christian God, but just the God has changed
yeah, I see what you're
changed the
saying.
changed the message, not like the core of the message, but at least the way it's delivered to better suit that culture, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I'd
Does that make
say
sense?
yeah. So like the answer there would be no. I see it as like all this sort of creation, all this sort of idea is very old, and over time, like oral tradition gets a bad rap in that it's bad to create for keeping history. I don't think it's definitely not that bad, but um, I'd see it as this one event happened where the Christian God created the universe and everything in it, created all people, and each culture has some sort of memory. Like they were created at that time, they have that memory, but over time, as cultures and peoples drift apart, the specifics were sort of changed and lost. So the ideas became corrupted or just details forgotten. So you can see a lot of commonality in creation beliefs and so forth, um, which, as I said before, is sort of what I like looking at. But there's also, so I guess the way it would be like saying Christianity has the best record of the events that happened, and other religions are sort of lacking in, mistaken in some of the details. It's probably the most simple way to put it. There's elements of truth and elements of the original picture in all languages. And I'm sort of open to the idea even that, like at least when it comes to creation and so forth, that there's errors in I suppose error is probably too strong a word, but I think that there's elements of early Christianity and of belief in human life that we can get from other religions that might have similarly been lost a bit in Christian tradition. We have later revelations from prophets with the Christian God, and we have the best we have in Jesus Christ, which is the Christian God manifest among us. So because of Israel's sort of, or because of the nations that God interacted with directly and their records, we are most correct, but that doesn't mean that there's not parts that we might have yet to learn, at least about some things, I suppose would be my view. Because like, especially in creation myths, you have a lot of universals, such as like flood myths are incredibly widespread from like Mesoamerica to China. You have a sort of conception of a large flood. Obviously, Noah's flood and its reality is sort of a different thing, and how symbolic is all that. But that's just one example of a sort of universal myth. In most, when you trace religious traditions right back to their sort of origin, a lot of the time you have the god associated with the sky, with the heavens, is the creator god. A lot of the time you have humankind made out of clay or some sort of substrate. But anyway, yeah, just a bunch of religious universals, and I see sort of the specific differences as being misrememberings, I suppose you'd say, of the original events, just due to thousands of years of time and space differences.
All right.
And in terms of like just in case it wasn't as clear before too, I don't think that God has, like, I don't think our ability, like it's, the humanity is the ability to morality. It's the consciousness, the ability to override what is natural and to think abstractly and conceive abstract notions, not as in there was an innate moral code imparted to us.
Sure,
And
yes.
so that wasn't different in other cultures or whatever. It's just we were given this ability and we were taught some degree of a way to, we were taught an ideal way of doing that. Or at least we are taught through Christian tradition. I'm not sure how much of that happened in like early human history, like sort of Christian early human history, how much of that was taught and expanded. Just in case anyone there was a bit confused. Because I think there is beliefs that that was, I'm forgetting the name of it, but there's a belief called natural, it's not natural wisdom or something. But there is some sort of idea that the Christian moral code was directly imparted into humanity, and that's why you have some of these cultural universals. It's that remembering of the natural code and the natural order. Like, I'm probably less favorable on that idea and more on the idea that we are taught the Christian code and the ability is given to us to follow it rather than that it was an innate construction.
Jesse, would that relate to the Romans passage talking about the law being written on our hearts?
Yeah. So like especially like that's one of the biggest changes
Or
of
the
the New
key biblical
Testament and so
references to it?
forth that has been given to us is that we have been given the Spirit of God within us in New Testament Christianity and given a like a essentially our moral precept is being strengthened and we're being shaped from this original sort of primal origins into being reshaped into something more like Jesus, where the natural precepts of God and the created order is a lot more directly within us. It probably sounds a lot more New Agey and abstract than what I actually think it does, but yeah, so the gist is that the law and what is right and wrong is written into our hearts now in the New Testament, as opposed to in the Old, where it's sort of we didn't have the ability to have the Spirit of God within us due to sin and its actions on humanity. And that all changed with Jesus coming and being a sacrifice for us, which does change a bunch of things in the Christian life that will continue to change up until death. Because it's only at death that the full recreation of the Christian is complete. And also the basis for a lot of what I said earlier is taken a lot from passages such as the earlier chapters of Romans you're looking at, which sort of gives a bit of like Romans 1 with its sort of overview of that, and then you've got Romans 2 where the idea that man has this sort of innate knowledge of right and wrong and God that can condemn or even, I'm pretty sure the wording is condemn or even excuse them at the day of judgment. So it's not so yeah, there's this sort of universal concept in morality that goes beyond there's a universal knowledge of God and following his way that even in cultures that have never heard of sort of this of Christianity, of Judaism before it and so forth, will have some element of that knowledge and will, if they continue to never hear of Christianity and Judaism and have the opportunity to follow this more complete picture of God, depending on how well they've followed and known who their creator is and what he wanted from them, that is what they are judged on. Right.
So did you expect this level of breadth tonight?
Sort of. Like I knew it'd be pretty broad, and in some part it's because I've been thinking about all this stuff that I suggested the topic.
Hmm.
Also, this is lined up really nicely. I just hit the credits in my game for the first time ever. So we have gone through the entire life cycle of a fake links in the time we have done this podcast. A fitting end to a discussion on creation.
Huh.
So as this fades out and we have the, I actually don't know how long these credits are, whether I should wait or not. Well, does anyone have anything else to add? Since I've done pretty much all the talking.
I'm not sure I have much to add to the discussion. I found it interesting to listen to in a perspective, I guess so, on Christian views of religion and intersection with morality. Enlightening, I guess. I mean, just from an outsider's perspective, because it's always better to understand what other people think and how they came to be at their current position.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I think even though I didn't talk much, I think I should write us down on most of the things. Like I honestly can't say I've thought as deeply as Jesse has on a lot of these things, which is interesting for me to listen to. I still think core beliefs that I have still stand for me, which is good. But yeah, it's interesting just to hear some of the other thoughts that are out there that you think there's a lot more depth in this topic.
Yeah, so a lot of like I've done a lot of thinking about this because this is sort of like these are sort of the intersection of my three areas of interest. You got like biology and specifically like behavior and ecology and evolution. You've got anthropology, like humans sort of working out how to live, how to think about things, how to build societies. And then you've got theology, God, like God's part in all this. What is God? Who is God? How does he interact with the world? Like if you, this is why my site is called Of God and Mind, because it's about God and it's about minds, both human, sometimes animal. I don't think I've actually posted a biology article yet, but there's potentially one in the works. I've considered a thing of going through Planet Earth 2 and just sort of doing like a crash course biology lesson if people are interested. But yeah, so this is kind of what I do, put things together. And it's like it's sort of it's my perspective on things. A lot of this is a piecing together of biblical evidence and a bunch of other evidence and so forth. Not everyone is going to think the same on this, and some of this is going to sound pretty out there and different to what for other Christians and what they believe about these same issues. But anyway, this has been a podcast. See you all next week.
Indeed, it has.
Been good.
Catch you
good.
later, folks.
Yeah.